The autumn leaves crunched beneath my boots as I walked up the familiar driveway of my childhood home in suburban Michigan. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the crisp November air, but my stomach churned with anxiety rather than hunger. Mom's voice echoed from the kitchen, sharp and commanding as always, directing my younger brother Jake on how to properly set the table. I paused at the front door, adjusting my civilian clothes and taking a deep breath before entering what I knew would be another battlefield. The house looked the same as it had for the past 20 years, but something felt different this time. Perhaps it was me who had changed. "Sarah, you're late," Mom announced without looking up from the gravy she was stirring, her tone carrying the same disappointment that had followed me through childhood. The dining room was perfectly arranged, just as it had been every Thanksgiving since Dad passed away 5 years ago. My brother offered me a sympathetic smile while arranging the silverware, but I could see the familiar tension in his shoulders that always appeared during family gatherings. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Bob sat in the living room, their conversation about the weather feeling forced and uncomfortable. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in on memories I'd rather forget. I hung my coat in the hallway closet, mentally preparing myself for the evening ahead. The dinner conversation started predictably enough, with Mom asking about my little job at the recruitment office with barely concealed disdain. She had never understood why I chose the military over the teaching career she had planned for me, and 22 years of service hadn't changed her opinion. Jake tried to steer the conversation toward safer topics, mentioning his recent promotion at the accounting firm, which earned him the praise I had long stopped expecting. Uncle Bob shared stories about his glory days as a high school football coach, while Aunt Margaret nodded politely and passed the mashed potatoes. The chandelier cast warm shadows across the mahogany table, but the atmosphere remained cold and strained. I picked at my food, wondering why I continued to subject myself to these annual rituals of disappointment. "You know, Sarah," Mom began, her voice taking on that particular tone that meant trouble was coming. "I was talking to Linda Henderson at the grocery store yesterday." She paused to take a sip of wine, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably before continuing with her story. Linda's daughter had just gotten engaged to a doctor, and apparently they were planning a spring wedding with all the trimmings. The comparison was obvious and painful, as Mom's stories always were, designed to highlight everything I wasn't accomplishing in her eyes. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing exactly where this conversation was heading. I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same one I'd carried since childhood whenever Mom decided to remind me of my failures. "She has 3 grandchildren now," Mom continued, her eyes fixed on me with laser precision. "And such a beautiful home in the suburbs." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention settling on my shoulders. I had heard variations of this speech countless times before, but tonight felt different somehow, more final and cutting than usual. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass, trying to maintain some semblance of composure under her scrutinizing gaze. The grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder than usual, marking time until the inevitable explosion that always came during these family gatherings. I wondered if this would be the year I finally found the courage to fight back. Then came the words that would change everything, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike to the heart. "You're 43 years old, Sarah, and what do you have to show for it? No husband, no children, no real career to speak of." Her voice grew louder and more venomous with each word, years of accumulated disappointment pouring out like poison. "You've never given me a single reason to be proud of you, not once in your entire life." The room fell silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I felt something inside me break under the weight of her words. Jake looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, while Uncle Bob and Aunt Margaret stared at their plates in uncomfortable silence. I sat there, frozen, feeling like that scared little girl again, who could never seem to do anything right in her mother's eyes. The silence that followed Mom's words was deafening, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. I stared down at my plate, the carefully arranged turkey, and stuffing blurring together as tears threatened to spill over. 22 years of dedicated service, countless commendations, and sleepless nights protecting my country seemed to evaporate under the weight of my mother's disappointment. Jake cleared his throat nervously, clearly wanting to say something but lacking the courage to confront our mother directly. Aunt Margaret reached across the table and gently patted my hand, her touch offering the only comfort in the room. The familiar shame washed over me like a tide, drowning out any sense of accomplishment or self-worth I had managed to build over the years. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, or perhaps to finally tell her how her words had shaped and scarred me, when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, and everyone froze as if caught in a snapshot of family dysfunction. Mom looked annoyed at the interruption, her expression suggesting that whoever was at the door had terrible timing. Jake jumped up eagerly, clearly grateful for any excuse to escape the dining room, but I motioned for him to sit back down. Something about the timing felt significant, though I couldn't explain why my heart had suddenly started racing. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time, and I found myself standing before I had consciously decided to move. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear Mom muttering about people having no manners, showing up uninvited during family dinner. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my feet, each step echoing in the hallway like a countdown to something momentous. Through the frosted glass panels, I could make out the silhouettes of 3 figures standing at attention on the front porch. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, and for a moment, I hesitated, sensing that opening this door would change everything. The brass handle felt cold against my palm, and I took a deep breath before turning it, wondering who could possibly be visiting on Thanksgiving evening. The door swung open to reveal 3 Army officers in their dress uniforms, their polished buttons gleaming under the porch light. Colonel Martinez, whom I recognized immediately, stood in the center flanked by 2 other officers I didn't know, but whose bearing suggested they held significant rank. They stood at perfect attention, their faces serious and formal, creating a stark contrast to the domestic chaos I had just left behind. The autumn wind caught their service ribbons, and I noticed snowflakes beginning to fall, dusting their shoulders with white. My mind raced as I tried to process why they were here, on this night, at this moment when my world felt like it was crumbling around me. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell," Colonel Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority and respect that had been absent from my mother's words just minutes before. The 2 officers beside him saluted in perfect synchronization, their movements crisp and practiced. "We apologize for the intrusion on your holiday, but we have urgent business to discuss." I felt my military training kick in automatically, my posture straightening, and my expression becoming more composed, despite the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. Behind me, I could hear movement in the dining room as my family realized something significant was happening. The cold November air rushed into the house, carrying with it the promise of change and the weight of official business. "Ma'am," the younger officer on the left spoke, his voice clear and respectful, "we need to speak with you about your new assignment." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my knees nearly buckle with the realization of what was happening. After years of applications, interviews, and waiting, the call had finally come, and it had arrived at the exact moment when I needed it most. Colonel Martinez nodded gravely, understanding the significance of the timing, while the 3rd officer held a sealed envelope that seemed to contain my entire future. I turned slightly to see my family crowding in the doorway behind me, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and growing awareness that something extraordinary was taking place. The moment stretched like eternity, balancing on the edge between my past and whatever was about to unfold. "Would you mind if we came in, Colonel?" Colonel Martinez asked, his tone both respectful and urgent. I stepped aside automatically, my military training overriding the shock that was still coursing through my system. The 3 officers entered with measured steps, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere of our small suburban home. Behind me, I could hear my family scrambling to make themselves presentable, suddenly aware that something far more significant than a family dinner was taking place. Mom appeared in the hallway, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious confusion and growing concern. The contrast between the officer's dignified bearing and the domestic chaos of our interrupted Thanksgiving was almost surreal. "Mrs. Mitchell," Colonel Martinez addressed my mother with the same respect he had shown me. "We apologize for interrupting your family gathering." His polite acknowledgement seemed to fluster her further, and I watched as she unconsciously smoothed her hair and adjusted her blouse. Jake, Uncle Bob, and Aunt Margaret hovered in the dining room doorway, trying to process what was happening while maintaining some semblance of decorum. The house suddenly felt too small to contain such formal military presence, and I realized that my two worlds were colliding in ways I had never imagined. The officers stood at attention in our living room, their uniforms and decorations telling stories of service and sacrifice that my family had never truly understood. The younger officer stepped forward and presented me with the sealed envelope, his expression grave and ceremonial. "Colonel Mitchell, by order of the Secretary of the Army, and with the approval of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you are hereby notified of your selection for promotion and reassignment." His words echoed in the silent room, each syllable carrying weight that seemed to press against my chest. I accepted the envelope with hands that had stopped trembling, my fingers tracing the official seal that would change everything. My family watched in stunned silence as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking the moment that would divide my life into before and after. Colonel Martinez cleared his throat and continued the formal presentation. "Colonel Mitchell, you have been selected to assume command of the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division, effective immediately following your promotion to Brigadier General." The words hit the room like a thunderclap, and I heard my mother gasp audibly behind me. A Brigadier General, the rank I had dreamed of since I was a young lieutenant, the position that represented the pinnacle of everything I had worked toward for over 2 decades. The 3rd officer produced a small velvet box containing the single star that would mark my new rank, its silver surface catching the light from the chandelier. I felt tears threatening to fall, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy and vindication rather than pain and disappointment. "Ma'am," the younger officer continued, "your outstanding leadership during Operation Desert Storm, your exemplary service record, and your innovative approaches to military strategy have earned you this distinction." Each word of praise felt like a healing balm after the wounds my mother had inflicted just minutes earlier. Behind me, I could hear Jake whispering explanations to Uncle Bob and Aunt Margaret, who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. My mother stood frozen in the doorway, her earlier words of disappointment hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had suddenly been extinguished. The officer's presence had transformed not just the room, but the entire narrative of who I was and what I had accomplished. The weight of the moment settled on my shoulders like a mantle of responsibility and honor. "You will be the youngest woman to achieve this rank in the history of the 82nd Airborne," Colonel Martinez added, his voice carrying obvious pride. "Your country needs your leadership, General Mitchell." The title sounded strange and wonderful in my ears, a validation of every sacrifice, every missed holiday, every moment of doubt I had endured throughout my military career. I straightened my shoulders and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not just the external recognition, but an internal acknowledgement of my own worth and accomplishments. The scared little girl who had sat at this very table, absorbing criticism and disappointment, was finally being replaced by the confident leader I had always been meant to become. I opened the envelope with steady hands, my eyes scanning the official letterhead and formal language that would reshape my future. The orders were clear and immediate. I was to report to Fort Bragg within 72 hours to begin the transition process. The magnitude of the responsibility settled on my shoulders like a well-fitted uniform. Challenging but comfortable, demanding but welcome. My family watched in stunned silence as I read, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and confusion at this sudden revelation of who I really was. The dining room, with its half-eaten Thanksgiving dinner and lingering tension, felt like a stage set from a play I was no longer performing in. Everything had changed in the space of a few minutes. and I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet in the most wonderful way. Colonel Martinez stepped forward to shake my hand, his grip firm and respectful. "Congratulations, General Mitchell. Your country is fortunate to have your leadership." The words carried weight and sincerity that made my chest swell with pride. Behind him, the other officers nodded their approval, their expressions conveying the respect that came with true understanding of what this promotion meant. I felt myself standing taller, my civilian clothes unable to diminish the military bearing that had always been my true identity. The room seemed brighter somehow, as if the formal recognition had switched on lights that had been dimmed for too long. My mother remained silent in the doorway, her earlier criticism rendered hollow by the undeniable evidence of my success. "General Mitchell," the younger officer said, presenting me with a second set of documents. "These are your preliminary briefing materials and security clearances." The papers felt substantial in my hands, representing classified information and strategic responsibilities that only a select few would ever be trusted with. I scanned the headings and felt my pulse quicken with anticipation. This was the work I had been preparing for my entire adult life. Jake stepped closer, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching wonder as he began to understand the significance of what was happening. The contrast between the military formality and our suburban Michigan setting created a surreal atmosphere that would be burned into my memory forever. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, I had no idea." The words trailed off as she struggled to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the accomplished officer standing before her. I turned to face her, and for the first time in decades, I saw something other than disappointment in her eyes. The recognition was painful and long overdue, but it was there nonetheless, a glimmer of pride that she had never allowed herself to express. The officers stood respectfully to the side, understanding that they were witnessing more than just a military promotion. Uncle Bob and Aunt Margaret moved closer, their earlier discomfort replaced by obvious admiration and curiosity about this hidden side of my life. 22 years of service, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. 22 years of deployments, combat operations, and dedication to something bigger than myself. The words weren't accusatory, but they carried the weight of all those missed holidays, all those achievements that had gone unrecognized or dismissed. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly, understanding the personal victory that was playing out alongside the professional one. My mother's face crumpled slightly, and I could see her beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what she had failed to see or acknowledge. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, marking yet another moment in this extraordinary evening. The third officer stepped forward with a final document. "General Mitchell, your first briefing is scheduled for Monday morning at 800 hours. The return to military time and protocol felt like coming home after a long journey. I accepted the papers with the same attention to detail I had always brought to my duties, already mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. The promotion would mean leaving Michigan, probably for years, but for the first time in my life, that prospect felt like freedom rather than exile. My family watched as I transformed before their eyes, shedding the role of disappointing daughter and embracing the identity of accomplished leader. The Thanksgiving dinner that had started with such pain was ending with a redemption I had never dared to hope for. The officers prepared to leave, their mission accomplished, and their respect for protocol evident in every gesture. Colonel Martinez handed me his card and reminded me about the Monday briefing, his expression conveying both congratulations and the serious nature of the responsibilities ahead. I walked them to the door, feeling the weight of my new rank settling into my bones like armor that finally fit properly. The November wind had picked up, and snowflakes swirled around the porch light, creating a magical atmosphere that seemed fitting for such a transformative moment. Behind me, my family remained in the living room, processing what they had just witnessed. The contrast between the military precision of the officers and the domestic chaos of our interrupted holiday would stay with me forever. After closing the door, I turned to face my family, the official documents still clutched in my hands. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. My mother looked smaller somehow, diminished by the realization of how wrong she had been about my life and accomplishments. Jake was the first to speak, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and apology. "Sarah, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were in the army, but I never understood." He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the documents that represented decades of dedicated service. Uncle Bob and Aunt Margaret nodded in agreement, their faces showing newfound respect and admiration. The dining room beyond still held our abandoned Thanksgiving dinner, but none of us seemed interested in returning to that interrupted meal. My mother finally found the courage to approach me, her steps hesitant and uncertain. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." Her voice cracked with emotion, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "I had no idea you were a general?" The word came out with something approaching reverence, and I realized that for the first time in my life, my mother was looking at me with genuine pride. The transformation was painful to witness, knowing how much heartache could have been avoided if she had simply asked about my work instead of dismissing it. But standing there in the hallway of my childhood home, wearing civilian clothes but carrying the weight of military command, I felt something like forgiveness beginning to bloom in my chest. "Mom," I said softly, "I've been trying to make you proud for 43 years." The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of all those missed opportunities and misunderstood achievements. "I just wish it hadn't taken 3 officers showing up at your door for you to see it." She nodded, tears flowing freely now, and I saw her begin to understand the depth of the pain she had caused. Jake moved closer, creating a small circle of family that felt different from anything we had shared before. The house around us remained the same, but the relationships within it had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in decades, I felt like I truly belonged in this space, not as the disappointment who came home for holidays, but as the accomplished woman I had always been. The evening continued with a very different kind of conversation, as my family peppered me with questions about my military career. I found myself sharing stories I had never told them, describing deployments and operations that had shaped me into the leader I had become. My mother listened with growing amazement, asking about my responsibilities and the soldiers under my command. Jake wanted to know about the places I had been stationed, while Uncle Bob and Aunt Margaret were fascinated by the logistics of military life. The Thanksgiving dinner grew cold on the table, but none of us cared. We were finally having the kind of conversation we should have been having for years. The walls of the house seemed to expand, making room for this new understanding and acceptance that had been so long in coming. As the evening wound down, I realized that this Thanksgiving had given me something I had never expected to receive. Not just military recognition, but family acceptance. The promotion to general was the culmination of decades of hard work and dedication. But seeing pride in my mother's eyes for the first time might have been even more meaningful. I packed my few belongings while my family helped, everyone understanding that this visit was ending differently than any before it. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the familiar suburban landscape with a blanket of white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start we were all being given. As I prepared to leave for Fort Bragg and my new command, I carried with me not just the weight of military responsibility, but the lightness that comes from finally being seen and appreciated for who you truly are.